presidential pass.
If you're a Democrat who's running for the president, your path right now is clear. You have to run against the Supreme Court.
The Supreme Court gives Trump a get-out-of-jail-free card.
Could a president take a bribe with impunity, with immunity?
Sure looks like it.
And Democrats' worst week ever only gets worse.
I have spoken to some top Democrats who say that there would actually be relief if he were to step down.
Veep stakes.
But I think of people like President Trump more as an elected leader than as a politician. I mean, he's really good at understanding politics.
Democrats' reluctance to draft Kamala Harris to top of ticket shows just how important Trump's pick will be.
I'll do whatever it takes to make sure that President Trump is the next President 47.
And next stop, Paris.
Look at this! The kid's coming back!
Quincy Wilson becomes the youngest ever U.S. male track Olympian. Imagine being just 16 and representing America in the Olympic Games.
Let's go, men's 400.
And we come on the air tonight with breaking news. President Biden will address the nation in less than an hour, 45 minutes time, about the Supreme Court's immunity ruling. The president left Camp David early to return to the White House for the speech. Of course, we will bring it to you live. The Supreme Court today dealt, as you know, a massive blow to prosecutors who charged Trump with trying to overturn the results of the 2020 election. In a 6-3 ruling along ideological lines, the justices decided Trump, and any president for that matter, has immunity for official acts conducted while that person is president. It's important to note there are a couple of nuances. They ultimately sent the case back to the lower courts, which will severely delay the case. It means the former president will likely not stand trial until after the election. This monumental decision from the High Court fundamentally changes the power of the presidency. We're going to dive into that decision with a legal scholar in just a moment. But first, questions about President Biden's cognitive ability remain top of mind and top of headlines. Today is the 1,258th day of the Biden presidency, and there are growing concerns about whether or not he should be seeking another 4 years. The editorial boards of the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, Washington Post, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, among others, have also called on President Biden to step aside. It follows his disastrous debate performance, but of course we don't need to tell you that he struggled to really keep his train of thought. His campaign is now running a new ad called I Know.
I'm not a young man, but I know how to do this job. I know right from wrong. I know how to tell the truth. And I know, like millions of Americans know, when you get knocked down, you get back up.
But it appears that voters have also soured on the 46th president. Look at this. 72% believe that he should not be seeking a second term. And that includes a stunning 46% of voters within the Democratic Party. But even with all of the uncertainty, there's still a strong coalition of supporters rushing to his defense. Many of them now work at MSNBC and CNN.
So many draw hope from his empathy and his ability to have perspective, even right now, and to persevere when he is completely counted out.
You can't bet on some white knight to stand between that guy and the White House or some easy, simple, uniting process. Right now, there's just Joe Biden.
The race has not fundamentally changed. I think there's universal agreement. It wasn't a great night for Joe Biden. He said as much. But what we see in all the data that has emerged since Thursday is the fundamental head-to-head hasn't shifted. People are not suddenly moving to Trump.
President Biden doesn't show any signs of shuffling away. This weekend, he and his family met in Camp David, and sources say the president's family trashed his advisors for the debate flop, which does seem odd because we cannot seem to find advisors who advocated for the president to tell folks, quote, we finally beat Medicare. His family urging him to continue with his campaign. Not surprising. First Lady Jill Biden is reportedly a huge proponent of keeping the Biden movement going. She was featured on the cover of Vogue today because nothing really appeals to working class voters like a Vogue magazine cover. In her interview, she said, we will not let those 90 minutes define the 4 years he's been president. We will continue to fight. And she added, We will always do what's best for the country. But you, the voter, is going to ultimately judge and decide about what's best for the country and what he will be doing for the next 4 years. But if Democrats are going to make a change at the top of the ticket, we do want to say that time is of the essence. President Biden arguably has about 37 days to decide. The deadline in Ohio, well, where the state requires party candidates to be determined, is August 7th. That's a very important date. If President Biden does stay through, he runs the risk of losing to the man that he's painted as the ultimate threat to democracy.
They're asking us to do our job, to protect freedom in our time, to defend democracy, to stand up aggression abroad and at home. A poison is running through our democracy and parts of the extreme press. Truth buried by lies. Trump's assault on democracy isn't just part of his past. It's what he's promising for the future.
What, in your view, constitutes the primary threat to freedom and democracy at home?
Donald Trump.
All right, we need the experts, right? Chris Hahn and Karen DeFilippi are standing by with their insight and analysis, and we can't wait. But tonight we want to start with NewsNation's Kelly Meyer, who is live for us in Washington with the very latest. Hi, Kelly.
Hey there, Elizabeth. Well, President Biden, he's making his way back to the White House earlier than expected after the weekend at Camp David that you mentioned, reassured by members of the Biden family to stay in this race. This is as his top campaign advisors are working the phones tonight, calling top donors to reassure them that Biden can beat Trump and can do this for another 4 years. We're told some donors have privately urged Biden to drop out of the race, and it comes as there are ongoing discussions in Washington circles as to what happens next. One source telling me there is pressure building on former Presidents Clinton and Obama to persuade Biden to drop out of the race, and some are pointing to what they say are two very different candidates between 2020 and 2024. Take a listen.
He sends out wishful thinking. He has executive orders that have no power. He hasn't lowered drug costs for anybody. He's been promising a health care plan since he got elected. He has none, like almost everything else he talks about. He does not have a plan. Making sure that we continue to strengthen our health care system, making sure that we're able to make every single solitary person eligible for what I've been able to do with the COVID, with dealing with everything we have to do with, look, if we finally beat Medicare.
We're told there is a lot of frustration from members of the Biden family directed at the campaign staff who helped prep Biden. One source summarizing the family's feelings as, quote, they did him a disservice. The president has said not to share those sentiments, and a senior Biden advisor denies that the family is upset. A spokesman for the Biden campaign is saying, quote, the aides who prepped the president have been with him for years, often decades, seeing him through victories and challenges. He maintains strong confidence in them. So we'll wait to hear what the president has to say here shortly on the immunity ruling from the Supreme Court today, just moments from now. Elizabeth?
All right. Kelly, thank you so much. If we can bring in our panel with the very latest. Chris, if I could start with you. We have, I'm not sure, Chris, okay. All right, Chris, the reason I want to get to you first is because I've been reading headlines since Thursday about the tear between what we see is the Democratic Party's wants and needs and then the Biden family. What is your take?
The Democratic Party is not a cult. It should not be rallying around one individual person. It should be doing what's in the best interest of the country and what's in the best interest of the party. And I think that Joe Biden is probably not going to win this election. And I think his performance on Thursday night was a disaster. And I appreciate him coming to the podium today and speaking. But if he's not going to stand there for a half an hour and take questions afterwards, I don't know what we're doing here. He needs to show the American people that he has that ability still. They are very concerned about what they saw the other night. It is not about the base of the Democratic Party. They're going to be with him no matter what. It is about the 6 to 8% of voters in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin, Arizona, Georgia, New Mexico that are going to determine the next president of the United States. And they were concerned about Joe Biden's age before the debate, and the debate made those concerns grow. All this talk about advisors prepping him, I don't believe any of that. Joe Biden's been in high elective office for over 50 years. He knows exactly what he's doing. He was not able to do it. It was political malpractice for them to do this debate, knowing he was in that condition. And now that they've done it, they've got to face the consequences. There are going to be some very difficult conversations in the next 2 weeks with the president. And I think ultimately he will not run.
You know, Chris, I'm a little bit surprised, actually, that this is your stance. And when you say that there are the diehards who are sticking with him, I mean, I would argue that that's fracturing, right? When you look at the 72% of those who feel as if he has mentally declined. And if you look at a state like New Hampshire, we're looking at some polling where, you know, just about a couple months ago, I mean, he's dropped 10 points rather. We're looking at a 42% approval rating for him, a 44% for former President Donald Trump. Karen, I think that we are starting to see a strong base slip away.
I don't think there's any. First of all, let me go back and just disagree with something Chris said, which is that I don't think Joe Biden is going to lose the election in November. I'm confident that he will win the election in November. And there doesn't seem to be as much evidence as people want to point to about this base slippage. I mean, if you look at the motivation and enthusiasm of the Democratic Party being Democratic voters across the country. The campaign had its best hour of fundraising immediately following the debate. In the time from the debate through Friday night, it had its best fundraising period ever. It had its biggest weekend of ground mobilization over the weekend. And if anybody was at that rally in North Carolina, they can tell you that the energy and enthusiasm was there. I think the president had, one bad performance. But also, if you went to his rally in Georgia after the debate, or if you were still at the Waffle House, I know that I went back to my hotel room and I was getting ready to go to bed, and the president was still at a Waffle House, greeting voters. So I think it is indicative of there was one bad performance. This does not, encapsulate the status of Joe Biden. And let's also remember that this is someone that we've often, kind of lowered expectations on and has always surpassed them. I think what we're missing in all of this is who he's ultimately running against. And I don't think that the standing of Donald Trump is any better with the American people. And what was on display at the debate on Thursday was someone who wants to be a dictator.
I agree 100% with you that Donald Trump should not be president of the United States again. 100%. It is my ultimate goal. And if the choice is between Donald Trump and a seriously incapacitated Joe Biden, even worse than he is now, I'm still voting for Joe Biden. The problem is my vote, your vote, he's got our votes. There's 6 to 8% of Americans that he's got to convince in swing states. And I am not so sure they are going to be convinced unless he does what I've been saying. Sit for long form interviews, press conferences, get out there and show us right away that this was not that this was just a bad night. But I haven't seen a willingness to do that. And if he goes up to the podium tonight, reads a statement, then walks off, that is not showing me anything. He needs to go to the podium. He needs to take questions on whatever topic they want to throw at him without his age jumping in. And he's got to show that he's still in command. Because this is
Chris,
what the swing voters want.
But you're advocating for that.
The base is irrelevant. They're with him.
On the record, you're advocating for more of him in impromptu situations. That's what you want. You think that's the solution?
100%. I think, if he wants to survive the next 30 days, he needs to be doing a lot of interviews the next 30 days, a lot of press conferences, a lot of impromptu press conferences, outside the helicopter, whatever he wants to do. But he's got to interact with people and show that maybe it was a bad night. Maybe he did have a cold. I don't know. All I know is that I've been defending him for the last 6 months, saying that I believe he's the right man for the job. And I think he's a wonderful person. I think he's been a great president. But I think that it's going to be very difficult for him to convince those undecided voters who were already concerned about his age that he's up for former. It doesn't mean they're going to vote for Trump, by the way. They just might not vote. And right now, if the election was held today and they didn't vote and they didn't swing to Biden, Biden loses. We've got to win because Trump is an existential threat. It cannot be about one person. As much as I love Joe Biden and respect Joe Biden and think he's been a great, consequential president, it is not about him. It's about the American people, and it's about what's in the best interest of this country.
All right. Well, Karen, I wish we had more time. Chris and Karen, thank you so much. But I do have you on the record that you want more of him. Like you said, we'll see what he does on the podium tonight. Thank you both for joining us tonight. Grateful for you. As I mentioned, we are just about 30 minutes away from taking you live to the White House, where we will listen to the president as he reacts to the Supreme Court ruling that came down this morning. Stay with us. We have much more after the break. All right, we have some breaking news. Live look at the White House. President Biden is getting ready to deliver his remarks on the Supreme Court's immunity ruling. We've been waiting all day for a reaction. It's a decision for the ages. We've been anticipating this for months. Today, in a 6-3 ruling, the Supreme Court ruled former President Trump has substantial immunity from prosecution for, quote, official acts committed while in office. It's important to note that it's official acts. A ruling that seemed to outrage Justice Sonia Sotomayor, who wrote in her dissenting opinion, the President of the United States is the most powerful person in the country and possibly the world. When he uses his official powers in any way under the majority's reasoning, he will now be insulated from criminal prosecution. Orders the Navy to SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival? Immune. Organizes a military coup to hold on to power? Immune. Takes a bribe in exchange for a pardon? Immune, 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 immune. Now, former President Donald Trump does appear to be quite pleased with today's decision made by the Supreme Court. In fact, judging by his Truth Social post, it seems he's actually quite ecstatic. Brilliantly written, historic big win for our Constitution and democracy, he declared after Chief John Roberts and the conservative Supreme Court ruled that the former president should enjoy immunity for anything deemed an official act while serving as president. Our friends at other networks such as CNN or MSNBC seem to have a different interpretation if you watch today.
I think politically, it's bad. It makes the Supreme Court look very partisan. They're supposed to be wearing these kind of black and white umpire jerseys or whatever. They look like they're wearing red jerseys or even MAGA hats.
What if the president decides that a political adversary is a threat to democracy and orders the killing?
This is not America. If you want to make America great again, you got to return to the rule of law.
So if you're like me, you're sort of wondering, what do we believe? What narrative is true? Tom Dupree, former Deputy Assistant Attorney General under George W. Bush, joins us now. Tom, as I mentioned during the break, I wish I had you on my pocket when we're trying to dissect this. And then I, like so many millions of people, we're trying to dive into some of the legalese and dive into the interpretation. And it seems it just depends on what network I was watching. Can you break it down for us today, your interpretation of the ruling?
Sure. My interpretation of the ruling is this. I do think it was a win for former President Trump. At the same time, the Supreme Court did not grant the extensive immunity that Trump wanted. In other words, there still are things that a president could do in office that could subject him to prosecution. As you noted, the Supreme Court drew a line between what it called official acts and what it called unofficial acts. And its opinion actually went into some detail, somewhat surprising level of detail, trying to explain the types of things that might be official acts and the types of things that might not be official acts. But I think the real test and the measure of this opinion is going to come at some future date. It's going to come first when the judge and Judge Chutkan in D.C. in the January 6th case sits down and goes through Jack Smith's indictment to try to figure out which charges can support a prosecution of Trump and which charges have to be basically thrown away because he's immune from them. So it is a significant decision. It's a historic decision. But I think the exact significance and the importance of this for our nation and our history probably remains a bit to be determined.
Well, and when you say that, can you elaborate for someone at home when it gets sent down to the lower courts? Explain to us what happens after that point, because for some people it feels cyclical, as if it could come back around.
Well, it sure could. And look, this may not be the last word the Supreme Court says on immunity. What's going to happen in the near term, though, is that first, Jack Smith is going to have to dust off his indictment, and I think he's going to have to go through it line by line and figure out which charges have to fall away and which charges he thinks he can sustain and move ahead on. Then Judge Chutkan is going to come in, and she'll obviously, I'm sure, hear from the Trump defense team about the things that need to get thrown out. And it's ultimately Judge Chutkan's call. She's going to do what Jack Smith does, which is go through this indictment line by line and say, look, I've now got the guidance from the Supreme Court. I'm told this is the dividing line between what can be charged and what can't. And I have to decide, okay, what survives and what doesn't.
You know, Tom, when you look at someone like the dissenting opinion, Justice Sotomayor, or even people on the left or people who just disagree with the opinion, where does that argument have a leg to stand on? Tell me more about that argument, that if you do give someone immunity, that, well, I guess there are no bounds. They could do whatever they please.
Well, there's certainly some force to what Justice Sotomayor said. And she wrote, I thought, a powerful and a passionate dissent. Doesn't mean I agree with it, but I do think her points need to be taken seriously. And look, her point, I think, at its heart is really this, that it's a huge fundamental tradition in our legal system that no one is above the law. And at least the way she reads the majority opinion, it puts the President of the United States above the law because it makes him immune from being prosecuted for charges that any other American could be prosecuted on. At the same time, I think the majority had a pretty good rebuttal to the concerns that Justice Sotomayor raised. They said, look, we hear what you're saying, but at the same time, we don't want to live in a world where the first thing a new president does when he gets into office is prosecute his predecessor. That would be crazy. That would put us into banana republic territory. So I think they acknowledge that Justice Sotomayor's concerns were valid, but they felt that the way they came out, giving presidents some degree of immunity, was absolutely necessary for our constitutional system to function.
Okay, and I only have about 15 seconds. There was a clause that says there was a presumption of immunity. What does that mean going forward? Is that the burden of proof?
Right. What that means he is probably immune from those things, but the judge is going to have to do a very close balancing to figure out whether he is in fact immune. He's presumed immune, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's automatically immune until the judge decides it.
All right. Well, Tom, we're so grateful for you. I mean, like I said, I wish I could just have you on speed dial because you help us understand some of these complexities and break down some of these interpretations. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We appreciate it. And as you know, we just have about a little more than 15 minutes, closer to 20 minutes before we hear from President Biden. He's going to be taking to the podium. This is what we've been waiting for all day, his reaction to the Supreme Court ruling. We're going to have much more on this story. Of course, we're going to bring you the president live when he does approach the podium in just about 20 minutes. So stay with us. We have much more after the break. And we are looking live at the White House. It is a big night tonight. President Biden is set to speak moments from now on the Supreme Court ruling, the one that grants former President Trump and any president for that matter with some type of immunity from prosecution under official acts. This is a win right now for the Trump team, right? While Democrats have been scrambling after the debate on Thursday, many are calling President Biden to step down as the Democratic candidate. But despite all the conversations, there isn't an obvious choice for a replacement or anyone stepping up, not even a current vice president. And the one that we have, Kamala Harris, no one's talking about her. It also makes former President Trump's search for his own running mate that much more exciting and enticing for people to follow. The list continues to narrow ahead of the RNC convention in 2 weeks, where Trump says he will announce his pick. You've got Doug Burgum, Marco Rubio, J.D. Vance. They're among some of the favorites for vice president. But until he announces, it's really anyone's guess for a role that's just a heartbeat away from the presidency. So with this, joining us now, Carly Cooperman, Democratic pollster and strategist, as well as Ashley Davis, former White House official for President George W. Bush. Listen, this is on the backdrop. We are waiting for President Biden, right? So, Ashley, I want to start with you. I'm looking at the approval rating on my screen now of President Biden. It's right above 50%. It's not terribly strong. If you look at the approval rating for his vice president, it's even lower, right? But we're having this conversation about a vice president. It's so important. What is going on with the Democratic Party?
Well, I think that Carly can probably answer this one a little bit better than I can in regards to what we think is going to happen with President Biden. But I do think that what they're facing in regards to replacing President Biden, if he would step down, is the fact that the vice president is even less popular than President Biden is right now. So that's going to be the heir apparent, so to speak, would not be an easy pick. And then if you do go beyond the current vice president, then the governors or senators that are currently in office that their names are being floated, whether it's the governor of California or Pennsylvania or Michigan, a lot of them haven't been battle tested countrywide. And so there is a big type of risk that if they would start a contested convention and start pitting these candidates against each other.
Well, I mean, Carly, when you talk about a contested convention, who wins in that scenario?
The Democratic Party does not want the chaos that could come with a contested convention. I do, though, think it would be very unlikely that the Democratic Party could not appoint Kamala Harris, who's already the vice president, who would be the first female and black presidential nominee. It would be very historic for the Democratic Party, and I think there's not really a scenario where she does not end up being the nominee if that were to be the case. That said, we do know that her favorability rating has struggled throughout the term of the administration, though that is something that you see happen with vice presidents. And I do think that Kamala has been out there this entire time making the case for Biden on his behalf and connecting with key voting blocs that are important to Biden in terms of young voters and women and people of color. And I think that if this were to happen, she would be the person that would be stepping up.
But Carly, I'm certain that you saw the Wall Street Journal piece on the vice president. And the fact is she's out there and she's connecting with people. She's making multiple campaign efforts, but it's not landing. I mean, she just doesn't have the popularity. But you're saying that she's a sure bet.
Well, I think the popularity thing is there's a few things happening. First of all, Kamala, for better or for worse, is to some extent tied to Joe Biden. She's the vice president and he's the president. And so as Biden's ratings struggle, Kamala's does as well. And yes, her ratings have consistently been below Joe Biden's. But in terms of the fact that she has already had a national presence for 4 years, she was on Joe Biden's ticket that did get elected president and vice president in 2020. And given her role in the position she's had so far, I can't imagine a world where the Democratic Party passes over her. But they're aware of the fact that it's also not a clean and easy thing. And I think that's part of the conversation that the Democratic Party is having right now.
Yep. All right, Ashley, let's go over to the GOP side. This is a list of candidates that we've been talking about. When you talk about a voter group that you want to target, what group is it? And what vice presidential pick would best suit that? So, for example, are you trying to court women? Are you trying to court the suburban vote? What does President Trump need?
What he needs are suburban women, actually, and is always his weakest area. And so there was for a long time the thought, or there was pressure on President Trump's campaign, does he pick someone like a Nikki Haley who was picking up those type of votes? The thing that's been interesting is, especially in the last 72 hours, is does President Trump need to pick someone like that because of his numbers going so much in the positive direction of him potentially winning, or does he just pick a safe bet, someone in the middle, someone like a Governor Doug Burgum, someone that doesn't really ruffle feathers either way? I think that he does, at least standing right now. Obviously, there's 2 weeks until the convention. He did say that he would be making the decision just right before the convention. And it may be someone that's not even on this list at all. I mean, one thing that we all know is that President Trump loves the drama. And, you know, I always say this is like The Apprentice happening in front of our eyes for vice president. I think that it could be someone that's not even being talked about at all. But I do think, going back to your original question, he does need suburban women, and he does need to pick up the moderate side of the Republican Party. However, the difference between this election and others in regards to the vice president is the fact that President Trump only has one term. So whoever's vice president will definitely be the heir apparent going into the next election in 2028.
Yeah, and you just wonder what conversations the Democrats are having, because like you said, it is an apprentice style, right? And we are talking about what's happening on the Democratic side, where we don't really know who to look at. And on the Democratic side, we have a long list of candidates, and there's so much to consider. So it's a lot to break down. Ashley and Carly, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We appreciate it. It's a conversation we could continue. We are just moments away from President Biden making his first comments on the Supreme Court's monumental decision in the Trump immunity case. Of course, we are going to take you live. It is less than 10 minutes away, so stay with us. We'll be right back after the break. Pictures now at the White House. Any moment now, President Biden will be addressing the nation. He will be talking about the Supreme Court decision regarding presidential immunity. Back now with NewsNation's Kelly Meyer and NewsNation Blake Berman, moderator of The Hill and chief Washington correspondent. Blake, I do have to start with you, despite the fact that we were just discussing the stresses of summertime. There's a lot of stresses in the political world. We're in an election cycle. It's not every day, and from your observations and Kelly's too, but it's not every day that we have a 7:45 press conference like this from the president. This is a big deal.
I don't think you can overstate enough how important, Elizabeth, this could potentially be for President Biden, for his campaign, and for Democrats who want him to stay in the race. You're right. It is 7:45 at night here on the East Coast, and the White House has made the decision, and potentially as well the Biden campaign has made the decision to put the president out front and center. Why? Because at some point, Elizabeth, at some point, you have to put the president on camera after his debate performance Thursday night. And obviously, the president is going to deliver a message here. The vehicle for this is the Supreme Court decision from today, right? But you have to put him out. And we'll see if he answers questions, right? Obviously, reporters are going to ask questions. This is for the audience at home, this is a pool scenario. So there's one camera, a handful of reporters here and there, a handful of photographers here and there. The reporters will shout questions. We'll see if the president answers them and if sort of this was their vehicle to get him out before the cameras.
Yeah, I have a screen on my left-hand side. We're watching the president approach now. Here he is approaching the podium.
The most powerful office in the world. It's an office that not only tests your judgment, perhaps even more importantly, it's an office that tests your character. Because you not only face moments when you need the courage to exercise the full power of the presidency, you also face moments where you need the wisdom to respect the limits of the power of the office of the presidency. This nation was founded on the principle that there are no kings in America. Each of us is equal before the law. No one is above the law, not even the President of the United States. With today's Supreme Court decision on presidential immunity, that fundamentally changed. For all practical purposes, today's decision almost certainly means that there are virtually no limits on what a president can do. This is a fundamentally new principle, and it's a dangerous precedent, because the power of the office will no longer be constrained by the law, even including the Supreme Court of the United States. The only limits will be self-imposed by the president alone. This decision today has continued the court's attack in recent years on a wide range of long-established legal principles in our nation, from gutting voting rights and civil rights, to taking away a woman's right to choose, to today's decision that undermines the rule of law of this nation. Nearly 4 years ago, my predecessor sent a violent mob to the U.S. Capitol to stop the peaceful transfer of power. We all saw it with our own eyes. We sat there and watched it happen that day. Attack on the police, the ransacking at the Capitol, a mob literally hunting down the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, gallows erected to hang the Vice President, Mike Pence. I think it's fair to say it was one of the darkest days in the history of America. Now the man who sent that mob to the U.S. Capitol is facing potential criminal conviction for what happened that day. And the American people deserve to have an answer in the courts before the upcoming election. The public has a right to know the answer about what happened on January 6th before they are asked to vote again this year. Now, because of today's decision, that is highly, highly unlikely. It's a terrible disservice to the people of this nation. So now, Now the American people have to do what the courts should have been willing to do, but will not. The American people have to render a judgment about Donald Trump's behavior. The American people must decide whether Donald Trump's assault on our democracy on January 6th makes him unfit for public office in the highest office in the land. The American people must decide if Trump's embrace of violence to preserve his power is acceptable. Perhaps most importantly, the American people must decide if they want to entrust the president once again, the presidency, to Donald Trump, now knowing he'll be even more emboldened to do whatever he pleases whenever he wants to do it. You know, at the outset of our nation, it was the character of George Washington, our first president, that defined the presidency. He believed power was limited, not absolute. And that power always resides with the people, always. Now, over 200 years later, today's Supreme Court decision, once again, it will depend on the character of the men and women who hold that presidency that are going to define the limits of the power of the presidency, because the law will no longer do it. I know I will respect the limits of the presidential powers I have for 3.5 years, but any president, including Donald Trump, will now be free to ignore the law. I concur with Justice Sotomayor's dissent today. Here's what she said. She said, in every use of official power, the president is now a king above the law. With fear for our democracy, I dissent. End of quote. So should the American people dissent. I dissent. May God bless you all, and may God help preserve our democracy. Thank you. And may God protect our troops.
Will you drop out of the race, President? Why are you the best Democrat to beat Trump?
What makes you so confident you should be the president?
What advice did your family give to President?
All right, so we just saw President Biden there for just about 5 minutes. I want to bring in Blake and Kelly. Question right off the bat. Kelly, he did not take questions. We heard them shouting questions. We knew they were going to shout questions. He did not shout questions. There was a number of notes that I was taking. He said, this says there's virtually no limits on what a president can do. He went on to say this fundamentally changes the presidency, if you will. Can you tell me your reaction?
And I think, look, it just re-energizes his campaign, his push, as he mentioned there, towards the end of his remarks, that this is really, get American people to the polls in November. Let them decide what they think about this. So this is really making this push for his campaign to look towards November to re-energize voters ahead of this. But it's interesting because now that pre-election trial looks unlikely with the way things went down today. So that would have opened up an opportunity for independents or undecideds to maybe, make the case there to those voters to go over to the Biden camp. So now they don't have that potentially. So he's really trying to make this push for them to go to the polls. He's saying Americans dissent, I dissent, really making that push there, Elizabeth.
Blake, I had Chris Hahn on the show earlier, and he said that he wants more impromptu President Biden, more answering questions, more out there, being on his feet and being able to speak. Your take on the fact that he didn't take reporters' questions, and also some of his comments about, power is limited, not absolute, but is it absolute now?
So here's what I took away from that. What has worked, Elizabeth, for Democrats, no matter what you think about abortion, whether you are for it or against it, and we're not going to change your mind, you have your thought. You cannot argue that what has been successful for Democrats hasn't been going after the Supreme Court. They have been extremely successful. All across this country, we have seen it in races time and time again on that issue after the decision that the Supreme Court made. Why am I talking about that? Because what we just saw from President Biden right there is, once again, going after the Supreme Court. In this case, a much different issue. Much, much, much different, right? But we have seen it work on that specific issue for Democrats. And what you just saw out of the president today, after his first time in front of the cameras after the debate, is once again highlight an issue from the Supreme Court. And I just wonder, Elizabeth, as we sit here and watch this and take it all in, if that is going to be part of the strategy for this president, which is on the issue that they have done well on, attack that issue and highlight what the court has done, and then separately on this issue, bring it back to the ruling today and try to make the case. This is what Donald Trump did in 2016, right? He put out that list of Supreme Court justices, and that helped get him elected in 2017. So here we are in 2024, and I think you potentially might see that on the other side of the aisle with the president using the Supreme Court as a foe for Democrats.
Wow, fascinating. Blake, Kelly, thank you so much. Appreciate you. The president spoke for just about 5 minutes. Of course, we have more analysis on the president's speech on the other side of the break. Stay with us. All right, we are back now with NewsNation's Kelly Meyer and Blake Berman, moderator of The Hill. Wow, we just heard President Biden spoke for about 5 minutes. Blake, I want to start with you. Undermines the rule of law of this nation, virtually no limits what a president can do. Your reaction to this historic speech?
Yeah, and we're already seeing the Trump team out on social media sort of pushing back against the president and saying, well, wait a minute, is he trying to undermine the rule of law? In any event, what I think the overarching question here, Elizabeth, is when and how and in what form and with who does the White House and or the Biden campaign decide to put the president out for question and answers before reporters, before anchors, whoever, to account for and to ask and to answer for the big question that overhangs this election right now? And that is what happened Thursday night.
Right. And Kelly, you have been watching this campaign. We only have about 30 seconds. Were you surprised he didn't take questions?
Not that surprised, but I think, like Blake said, there needs to be an opportunity for that to happen. We're happy to see that he came out and talked about this and did attempt, or there were an ability for press to ask questions, but he turned away and didn't take those. We know there's a White House briefing tomorrow. There's other opportunities for hopefully us to ask the president questions, but there will be a point where he will have to address some of the questions remaining from Thursday night. Elizabeth?
Well, I thank you very much for joining us, both of you, and I thank you at home for joining us. Again, we had a historic speech from the president about 5 minutes this evening where he spoke, and he said at one point there's virtually no limits to what a president can do. I am certain that Chris Cuomo is up right now, and he will discuss more about the president's speech.